This house was never yours, my son said at dinner, his voice steady, loud enough for everyone to hear. The room went quiet. No one corrected him. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply set my fork down and looked at the table. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end and let me know where you're watching from. The dining room felt different that night, not because anything had changed physically, but because something invisible had shifted. The long oak table still sat in the center of the room. The chandelier still cast the same warm light. The chairs were all filled. My son, my daughter-in-law, my grandchildren, a couple of relatives visiting from out of state. It should have felt full. Instead, it felt hollow. I had cooked for hours. A roast in the oven, green beans sautéed with garlic, mashed potatoes the way my husband used to like them. I'd even baked a pie, though my hands ached halfway through and I had to sit down more than once. At my age, standing too long comes with a price. Still, I wanted the night to feel normal. Family dinners mattered to me. They always had. My husband had been gone for less than a year. 38 years of marriage, reduced to a box of paperwork and a quiet house. After he passed, my son suggested everyone come over more often. You shouldn't be alone, Mom, he'd said. I believed him. So when they arrived that evening, I smiled. I asked about school projects and work schedules. I refilled glasses. I listened more than I spoke. No one mentioned my husband. I didn't expect them to. Halfway through the meal, my daughter-in-law laughed at something on her phone. My son leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, relaxed, comfortable. That's when it happened. This house was never yours, he said casually, as if he were correcting a small mistake. Dad handled all of that. The words landed heavier than he intended, or maybe exactly as he intended. My daughter-in-law didn't look surprised. She took a sip of water and glanced at the kids. One of my grandchildren looked up at me, confused. The others kept eating. I felt my chest tighten, but I stayed still. Years ago, I would have responded immediately. I would have explained. I would have reminded him of late nights balancing bills, of checks written from my account, of sacrifices made quietly. That night, I did none of that. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. My hands were steady. I noticed that before anything else, steadier than I expected. The dining room clock ticked loudly. No one spoke. My son didn't look at me. He stared at his plate as if the matter were settled. I looked around the table and realized something then. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a careless comment. It was a line being drawn. After dinner, I cleared plates while everyone moved into the living room. I heard laughter from the couch. Someone turned on the television. Life continued, just not with me at the center of it anymore. Later that night, when the house was quiet again, I stood alone in the kitchen. The pie sat untouched on the counter. I wrapped it carefully and placed it in the refrigerator. I didn't cry. Instead, I thought about the mortgage statements I used to file away, the checks I had written without ceremony, the documents I hadn't looked at in years because I trusted the people around me. That night, something else settled in, cold, calm, and clear. If this house was never mine, then it was time to understand exactly what I had been paying for all these years. The house felt larger the morning after the dinner, not brighter, not warmer, just larger, like the walls had stepped back. I woke before sunrise, the way I always do now. The other side of the bed was cold, smooth, untouched. My husband used to wake first, shuffle to the kitchen, and start the coffee before I even opened my eyes. Now the silence arrived before I did. I sat on the edge of the mattress for a long moment, listening. No voices, no footsteps, just the low hum of the refrigerator downstairs. When I finally walked into the kitchen, the clock on the stove read 6:12 a.m. I filled the kettle and set it on the burner. The motion was automatic. Muscle memory from decades of mornings that began the same way. I poured 1 cup instead of 2. The dining table was still set from the night before. A few crumbs near my grandson's seat. A water ring where my son had rested his glass. I wiped the surface slowly, carefully, as if erasing proof that the evening had ever happened. After my husband passed, the house changed in small ways. Not all at once. Slowly. Almost politely. My son started referring to it as the place instead of home. My daughter-in-law rearranged the pantry without asking. Boxes appeared in the garage, labeled neatly, though none of them were mine. Conversation stopped when I entered a room. Decisions were made before I was consulted. I told myself it was grief. Everyone processes loss differently. That's what people say. Still, I noticed things. The mail was sorted before I saw it. Certain envelopes disappeared entirely. Once I asked about a property tax notice I couldn't find. My son said he'd taken care of it. His tone suggested the matter was closed. I didn't press. After breakfast, I carried my coffee into the living room and sat in my usual chair. Sunlight spilled through the window, landing on the framed photos along the mantel. Birthdays, graduations, Christmas mornings. My husband stood beside me in most of them, his hand always resting lightly at my back. I stared at one photo longer than the others. It was taken the year we moved into this house. We looked tired, proud, hopeful. I remembered signing papers at the kitchen table late one night, my handwriting uneven from exhaustion. I remembered telling myself it was worth it. The phone rang just before 10. It was my sister, calling to check in. I told her I was fine. I meant it in the narrowest sense of the word. I was breathing. I was upright. I was still here. After the call, I went to the hallway closet and pulled out a small metal box from the back shelf. It was heavier than I expected. Inside were old folders, receipts, documents I hadn't touched in years. I hadn't needed to. I sat at the kitchen table and opened the first folder. Then the second. Names, dates, numbers. Some of them were familiar. Others weren't. I didn't panic. I didn't rush. I simply read. Outside, a car door slammed. Voices floated through the open window. The house was waking up again, filling with sound. I closed the folder and slid it back into the box. By the time my son came home that afternoon, I was washing dishes at the sink. He asked if I needed anything. I said no. That was still true. What I needed, I was beginning to understand on my own. By the third day after the dinner, I started noticing patterns I could no longer ignore. It wasn't anything dramatic. No shouting, no slam doors. Just small changes that, taken alone, could be dismissed. Together, they formed something else. My son stopped knocking before entering my room. He would pause at the doorway instead, as if checking whether I was awake, then step in with a quick question. Always practical. Always rushed. Never personal. My daughter-in-law began referring to things in the house as ours. Not in front of me at first. I heard it when she was on the phone. We're thinking of repainting. We might rent out the back room. Her voice was calm, confident, settled. Once, she moved a framed photo from the hallway. It was an old picture of my husband and me on our anniversary. I found it later on a shelf in the laundry room, leaning against a bottle of detergent. When I asked about it, she smiled and said she needed the wall space. I nodded. That afternoon, I went to the bank to deposit a check from my pension. I'd done this same routine for years. The teller recognized me and asked how I was doing. I said fine. She glanced at her screen a little longer than usual, then frowned. "Did you mean to change this account?" she asked. I leaned closer. The number she showed me was familiar, but not mine. It was an account I recognized from old paperwork, an account my husband and I had once opened together, then stopped using. "I didn't request any changes," I said. She hesitated, then apologized and said she'd double-check. I told her not to worry and completed the deposit. As I walked out, the thought stayed with me. Quiet, persistent. That evening, my son mentioned a letter that had arrived for me earlier. He said he'd put it somewhere safe. When I asked where, he waved his hand and said he'd look later. He didn't. After dinner, I returned to the metal box in the closet. I spread the folders across the bed and took my time. Statements, old tax forms, mortgage records. My name appeared again and again, not as an afterthought, not as a secondary signature, as a payer. I remembered nights balancing the checkbook while my husband slept in the next room. I remembered taking extra shifts at the library when money was tight. I remembered writing checks and mailing them without telling anyone, because that was how marriages worked. Quiet cooperation, shared responsibility. Downstairs, I heard laughter, my grandchildren running through the hallway. The sound made me pause. I didn't want to become someone bitter. I didn't want to be suspicious of my own family. So I closed the folders and put everything back. The next morning, a locksmith's business card sat on the kitchen counter. I asked my daughter-in-law about it. She said they were just exploring options. Her tone suggested I didn't need to know more. I rinsed my cup and set it in the rack. Later that day, I overheard my son talking in the garage. He lowered his voice when I came closer, but not fast enough. I heard my name. I heard the word documents. I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table. The sunlight hit the same spot it always did. Nothing had changed, except me. For the first time, I stopped assuming confusion. I stopped telling myself it was grief or stress or poor communication. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't accuse. I simply accepted that whatever was happening, it wasn't accidental, and I needed to understand it fully before saying another word. That night, I dreamed of the house the way it used to be. Not cleaner, not newer, just quieter in a different way. Back then, silence meant rest, not tension. It meant my husband was reading in the living room, his glasses slipping down his nose. It meant the day was done. It meant safety. I woke before dawn again, the dream still heavy in my chest. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening for sounds that weren't there. No footsteps, no voices, just the faint ticking of the clock down the hall. I got up slowly and pulled on a sweater. The mornings had started feeling colder, even though the thermostat hadn't changed. In the kitchen, I stood by the window and watched the sky lighten. This was the hour my husband used to love. He would stand beside me, coffee in hand, pointing out small things. The neighbor's dog, a new bird at the feeder, the way the light hit the driveway just right. We had chosen this house together. I remembered the first time we walked through it. The paint was outdated, the carpets were worn, but he squeezed my hand and said, "We can make this work." And we did. Year after year, payment after payment, repair after repair. I remembered the night the water heater failed. It was winter. Money was tight. He sat at the table with his head in his hands, and I told him I'd take on extra hours. He looked at me like I'd saved him. I never reminded him of that. I never needed to. Those memories stayed with me as I moved through the house that morning. I opened drawers, cabinets, closets. Everything was where it always had been, yet it no longer felt like it belonged to me. After breakfast, my daughter-in-law came into the kitchen and asked if I'd seen a folder with blue tabs. I told her no. She thanked me and continued looking, opening drawers without hesitation, as if she'd done it 100 times before. I watched her from the sink. She didn't notice. Later, my son mentioned that they might need more space soon. He said it casually, like a passing thought. He didn't say where that space would come from. He didn't have to. I spent the afternoon in my room with the door closed, something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out old notebooks and journals. Nothing dramatic. Grocery lists, notes. Small records of ordinary life. Dates, amounts, initials, patterns. I didn't feel angry. That surprised me. What I felt instead was clarity. A slow, steady understanding settling into place. This wasn't about grief anymore, or misunderstanding, or family growing pains. This was about control. That evening, as everyone gathered in the living room, I stayed behind. I listened to their voices from a distance, laughter, conversation, plans being made without me. I realized then that my absence had already been rehearsed, quietly, carefully. When my son came to check on me, I told him I was tired. He nodded and said we'd talk later. He didn't sound concerned, just relieved. After he left, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room. My room. For now. I thought about all the times I had stayed quiet to keep peace, all the times I had trusted without question, all the times I had chosen family over certainty. That night, I made a small decision. I would stop filling in the blanks for them. I would stop assuming good intentions. I would stop protecting people who were no longer protecting me. I turned off the lamp and lay down, my hands folded neatly over my stomach. I didn't know exactly what I would do next. But for the first time since the dinner, I knew one thing for certain. I was done being confused. The invitation came 2 days later, slipped into conversation as if it were nothing. "We're having everyone over Sunday," my daughter-in-law said while scrolling on her phone. "Just something simple. A family meeting, I guess." She didn't look up when she said it. I nodded and continued drying the dishes. My movements were slow, deliberate. I already knew it wouldn't be simple. Nothing was simple anymore. Sunday afternoon, the house filled earlier than usual. Chairs were pulled closer together. The coffee table was cleared. Papers sat neatly stacked beside my son's laptop. I noticed that right away. Everyone took a seat. Everyone except me. I stood near the doorway for a moment, unsure where to go, then chose the armchair at the edge of the room. It wasn't where I usually sat. No one offered to move. My son cleared his throat. He spoke carefully, the way he used to when he was about to ask for something as a child. "We've been thinking about the future," he began, "about what makes the most sense for everyone." My daughter-in-law nodded along, her hands folded neatly in her lap. They talked about rising costs, about responsibilities, about how hard it was to manage everything at once. Words like practical and reasonable came up more than once. No one said my name at first. Then my son did. "Mom," he said, finally looking at me, "this house is a lot for one person. We think it might be time to make some changes." I didn't interrupt. My daughter-in-law leaned forward. "We just want what's best for you," she said. "Somewhere smaller, easier, less stress." I waited. They talked about senior communities, about freeing up space, about selling options, though they didn't say that word directly. They didn't need to. I looked at the stack of papers on the table. Forms, printouts. A pen placed carefully on top, angled toward me. That's when I understood. This wasn't a discussion. It was a presentation. At some point, my son slid one document closer to the edge of the table. Not all the way to me, just enough. "If you could just look this over," he said. "No rush. We can talk through it." I didn't reach for it. I looked around the room instead. At faces I had fed, supported, defended. At people who had once asked me for advice and now spoke as if I weren't fully present. No one raised their voice. No one sounded cruel. That was the part that hurt the most. I nodded once. "I'll read it later," I said. My voice didn't shake. I noticed that, too. The meeting ended shortly after. Chairs scraped, cups were refilled, conversation shifted to lighter things, as if something heavy hadn't just been placed in front of me. That evening, after everyone left, I returned to the living room alone. The documents were still there, waiting. I picked them up and carried them to the dining table. I read every page slowly, line by line. I recognized the language. I'd signed things like this before years ago when trust had filled in the gaps. I didn't sign anything. Instead, I placed the papers back in their folder and set them beside my purse. Later that night, I stood in the hallway and looked at the front door. I imagined my things boxed up, labeled, moved without me deciding. For the first time, I didn't feel afraid. What they thought was a conclusion felt more like a beginning to me. They had shown their hand, and now I knew exactly what I was dealing with. After the meeting, I stopped pretending I didn't remember the past. It came back to me in pieces, quietly, as I moved through the house in the days that followed. Not as regret, as inventory. I remembered the first year my son moved back in after college. He was unsure of himself then, careful with money, embarrassed to ask for help. I told him not to worry. I covered groceries, utilities, small things at first, then bigger ones. When he married, they needed time to get on their feet. That was the phrase they used. I let them take the larger bedroom. I moved my things without complaint. I told myself it was temporary. When my grandchildren were born, childcare became expensive. I adjusted my schedule. I retired earlier than planned so I could help. I watched them grow from the living room window, waving goodbye as my son left for work, trusting that I was needed. When repairs came up, I paid without discussion. The roof, the plumbing, the property tax increase that caught everyone off guard. I didn't announce it. I didn't keep score. That wasn't how family worked, or so I believed. One afternoon, while sorting laundry, I found an old notebook tucked behind the dryer. I hadn't seen it in years. Inside were notes in my own handwriting. Dates, dollar amounts, short reminders written in pencil. I sat on the floor and flipped through it slowly. There it was. Proof of things I'd convinced myself didn't need proof. I wasn't angry reading it. I felt something steadier than anger. Recognition. That evening, my daughter-in-law asked if I could start keeping my things more contained. She said it kindly, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She gestured toward the hallway, toward the room that used to be mine before it became shared space. I said nothing and folded another towel. Later, my son mentioned they might need to change some routines. Just for efficiency, he said. He avoided my eyes. I realized then that my generosity had been rewritten in their minds. What I remembered as support had become entitlement. What I thought was partnership had become permission. They didn't see what I'd done because I'd never asked them to look. That night, I took the notebook into my room and placed it beside the metal box. I added a few more documents. Not everything, just enough. I wasn't collecting evidence to accuse anyone. I was grounding myself in facts. The next morning, I went for a walk around the block. I hadn't done that in a while. Neighbors waved. One stopped to ask how I was holding up. I told her I was managing. And I was. When I returned, the house was quiet. I stood in the entryway and looked around, not as a resident waiting to be included, but as someone taking a final measure of a place she knew intimately. Every corner held a memory of effort, of contribution, of choice. They thought I was passive because I had been patient. They thought I was unaware because I hadn't spoken. They were wrong. By the end of the week, I knew exactly what I had given, exactly what had been taken for granted, and exactly what still belonged to me, whether they acknowledged it or not. For the first time in years, I wasn't operating on hope. I was operating on clarity, and that made all the difference. The call came on a Wednesday morning, just after 9. I recognized the number immediately. I hadn't dialed it in years, but I'd memorized it back when paper statements still mattered and people spoke to you instead of machines. The bank. I let it ring twice before answering. They asked to confirm my name, my address, my date of birth. Their voice was polite, careful, professional. That alone told me something wasn't routine. "We're reviewing an account connected to your name," the woman said. There were some recent inquiries, and we wanted to make sure everything was authorized. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where the documents had been placed days earlier, the same table I had paid for. "Yes," I said calmly. "What seems to be the issue?" She explained slowly. "An old account, dormant for years, reactivated recently, access requests made by someone listed as a related party but without the necessary authorization." She paused, waiting for my reaction. I thanked her and asked for the details. As she spoke, I watched the sunlight move across the floor. Nothing in the house stirred. My son and daughter-in-law were out. The grandchildren were at school. For once, the house was mine again, fully, completely. After the call ended, I didn't move right away. I sat there, hands folded, letting the information settle. It didn't feel shocking. It felt confirming. Later that afternoon, I went upstairs and opened the metal box again. I added one more note to the pile. Date, time, name of the person I spoke with. That evening, my daughter-in-law asked if I had made any phone calls that day. Her tone was casual, too casual. I looked up from my book and met her eyes. "Yes," I said. She smiled thinly and nodded. "Just checking," she said, and walked away. An hour later, my son came into the room. He sat across from me, elbows on his knees. He didn't mention the bank. He talked about work, about schedules, about traffic. I listened. At one point, he said, "We've been trying to handle a lot lately. I hope you understand." I closed my book and placed it beside me. "I do," I said. That was all. That night, not because I couldn't sleep, not because I was anxious, but because my mind was active in a way it hadn't been in months. I wasn't replaying conversations. I wasn't questioning myself. I was connecting dots, the missing mail, the documents placed in front of me, the sudden interest in accounts that had been quiet for years, the pressure wrapped in soft language. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't sloppy. It was planned. The next morning, I dressed carefully and left the house early. I didn't say where I was going. No one asked. I drove past familiar streets, past places my husband and I used to go on weekends. I parked across from a small office building with frosted glass windows and a discreet sign. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and paper. I gave my name at the front desk. They were expecting me. As I sat down, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear, not anger, control. For years I had stayed quiet because I believed silence kept peace. Now I understood something different. Silence also buys time, and time used properly changes everything. The meeting in the small office lasted less than an hour, but it changed the way I looked at everything. I sat across from a woman not much younger than my son. She spoke clearly, without rushing, sliding documents across one at a time. I recognized my own signature on some of them. Others were unfamiliar, but the pattern was easy to see. Accounts tied to my name, payments traced back to my income, decisions made without my consent. Nothing illegal yet, she said carefully. But close. Too close to ignore. When I left the building, the afternoon sun felt sharper than usual. I sat in my car for a moment before turning the key, letting the weight of what I'd learned settle into place. I didn't feel betrayed in a dramatic way. I felt corrected. Back home, the house sounded the same. The television murmured from the living room. Someone laughed. The smell of food drifted from the kitchen. Life continued as if nothing had shifted, but it had. That evening, I began to notice how carefully things were being said around me. Questions phrased as suggestions, statements disguised as concern. My daughter-in-law asked whether I still needed certain mail delivered here. My son mentioned consolidating household finances to make things easier. I nodded. I listened. Later, alone in my room, I spread the documents across the bed. Not everything, just what mattered. I read them slowly, matching dates to memories. Late nights, extra shifts, checks written quietly so no one would feel burdened. The numbers told a story I'd never said out loud. I had paid more than I realized, for longer than I remembered. The next day, a neighbor stopped me while I was watering the front plants. She said she'd heard the house might be changing hands. I smiled and said, "People talk too much." She laughed and agreed. Inside, something hardened. That afternoon, a package arrived addressed to my son. He opened it at the counter, flipping through the contents quickly before sliding them into a drawer. I caught a glimpse of official letterhead. I didn't ask. That night, as I washed dishes, my daughter-in-law stood beside me and said, "You know, we're just trying to do what's best." I looked at the reflection of us in the window. Her face was calm, practiced. "So am I said. She paused, just long enough to notice. I slept well that night. The following morning, I made copies. Not many, just enough. I placed them in an envelope and wrote my name on the front. I didn't hide it. I didn't label it urgent. I put it in my purse. Over the next few days, I said less. I moved slower. I stopped offering help before it was asked for. I watched how quickly discomfort surfaced when I didn't fill the silence. They noticed. One evening, my son asked if everything was okay. He said it gently, but his eyes searched my face for something. Yes, I told him. And this time, it was true. Because I finally understood what had been happening. Not just to the house, but to me. I hadn't been pushed out all at once. I'd been edged out carefully, piece by piece, while being told it was for my own good. Now I had facts, names, dates, and with that came something stronger than anger. Direction. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be based on assumptions or trust. It would be based on truth. And I was ready for that. The person I met that week wasn't someone from my family. That was the first difference that mattered. She was an old friend of my husband's, someone I hadn't seen in years. We ran into each other by chance outside the grocery store. She recognized me before I recognized her. Said my name softly, like she wasn't sure I'd want to hear it. We sat on a bench near the entrance, carts passing in front of us. She asked how I was doing. I told her the truth in the simplest way possible. "I'm adjusting." She nodded. Then she hesitated. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you," she said. "I didn't know how." I waited. She told me she still handled some of the financial paperwork from the old days, that my husband had trusted her, that not long before he passed, he'd asked her to keep an eye on things, just in case. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious, she said. Now I'm not so sure. She didn't accuse anyone. She didn't use names. She simply said there had been questions, transfers that didn't quite add up, requests that hadn't gone through the proper channels. She said she'd tried to reach me once, months earlier. The letter was returned. She assumed I'd moved. I felt something settle in my chest then. Not surprise. Confirmation. We exchanged numbers before parting. She squeezed my hand as she stood. "You're not imagining things," she said quietly. "I wanted you to know that." I drove home slowly. When I walked into the house, my daughter-in-law was on the phone. She lowered her voice when she saw me. My son wasn't home yet. I went to my room and closed the door. I sat on the bed and stared at the wall, letting the day replay itself. Not emotionally, logically. That evening, my son asked if I'd run into anyone interesting. He tried to sound casual. I said I'd seen an old acquaintance. "Anyone I'd know?" he asked. "No," I said. He nodded, as if that answered something for him. Later, I received a text message from the woman I'd met. Just an address and a time. No explanation. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I took out the envelope in my purse and added one more name to the list I'd started keeping. Another thread connecting itself quietly. The next morning, I left early. I told no one where I was going. I didn't need permission. The office I visited wasn't large, just a few chairs, a desk, a window overlooking a parking lot. The woman greeted me like she'd known me for years, even though this was our first real conversation. She listened. That was the most important thing. I spoke plainly about payments, about documents, about conversations that felt rehearsed. I didn't dramatize. I didn't ask what I should do. She nodded and took notes. "There's nothing you need to decide today," she said, "but you're not without options." I thanked her and left. That night, dinner was quiet. My daughter-in-law talked about schedules. My son scrolled on his phone. I ate slowly and excused myself early. In my room, I placed the new business card beside the others. The pile was growing, not in size, but in meaning. For the first time since my husband died, I felt supported by someone who had no personal stake in the outcome. No guilt, no pressure, no expectations, just clarity and steadiness. I laid down that night with the light off, listening to the house breathe around me. Whatever they thought I knew or didn't know was no longer accurate. I wasn't standing alone anymore, and that changed the balance in ways they hadn't anticipated. I didn't change anything right away. That was deliberate. In the days that followed, I moved through the house the same way I always had. I made coffee in the morning. I folded laundry in the afternoon. I listened more than I spoke. From the outside, nothing looked different. Inside, everything was measured. I stopped volunteering information. I stopped filling the quiet with explanations. When my daughter-in-law asked questions framed as concern, I answered briefly. When my son mentioned plans without asking my opinion, I nodded and said I understood. They seemed relieved by my calm. What they didn't realize was that my silence had changed purpose. Before, it was meant to keep peace. Now, it was meant to observe. One evening, I noticed my son reviewing paperwork at the dining table. He closed a folder quickly when I walked in. I didn't slow my step. I poured myself a glass of water and returned to my room. Later, I heard voices in the kitchen. Low, careful, the kind of conversation people have when they believe timing is on their side. I lay on my bed and listened without straining. The next morning, I went through my closet and sorted my belongings. Not to pack, to organize. I separated what was sentimental from what was replaceable. Letters, jewelry, old photographs. I placed them into boxes and labeled them neatly. When my daughter-in-law saw the boxes, she asked if I was planning something. "Just tidying," I said. She smiled, but her eyes lingered on the labels longer than necessary. That afternoon, I drove to the post office and rented a small box. I redirected my mail quietly. No announcement, no discussion. I also changed the password on an account I knew they didn't expect me to check anymore. The confirmation email came through immediately. I deleted it after reading. At dinner that night, my son mentioned an upcoming deadline. He said it in passing, watching my face for a reaction. I continued eating. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yes," I said. It was the truth. The next day, I met again with the woman who had listened so carefully before. I brought only copies this time. We went through them slowly. She explained what could wait and what shouldn't, what required action and what required patience. "You don't need to confront anyone yet," she said. I nodded. I already knew that. Back home, I placed the copies in a different envelope. This one stayed hidden. Not because I was afraid of being discovered, but because some things are more effective when they arrive unexpectedly. That weekend, my daughter-in-law suggested we all go out together. A gesture, an attempt at normalcy. I agreed and smiled in the right places. I laughed when expected. I watched how carefully they behaved around me now, how conversations stopped mid-sentence, how decisions were softened, delayed. They sensed a shift. They just couldn't locate it. On Sunday evening, after everyone went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table and reviewed everything one last time. Not emotionally, practically. I wasn't planning to argue. I wasn't planning to beg. I wasn't planning to explode. I was planning to be precise. Before turning off the light, I wrote one sentence on a small piece of paper and slipped it into my purse. Not a threat, not a demand. A reminder. I slept soundly that night. Whatever they believed was coming, whatever outcome they were preparing for, was based on an old version of me. That version no longer applied. And soon enough, they were going to realize that patience, when paired with clarity, is not weakness. It's leverage. The shift became impossible to ignore the following week. It happened during another dinner, smaller this time, just the four of us. No relatives, no noise to hide behind. My son cleared his throat and said they needed to talk. The words were familiar, rehearsed. I recognized the rhythm now. He didn't invite me to sit. He assumed I already would. I took my place at the table and folded my hands. My daughter-in-law sat straight-backed, her expression careful. Too careful. We've been going over everything again, my son began. The house, the finances, long-term plans. I waited. There are some things we didn't fully understand before, he continued. Some details we want to clarify. Clarify. That word again. He slid a folder across the table toward me. Not aggressively, not timidly either. Just enough to suggest cooperation. I didn't touch it. Instead, I looked at him. You said this house was never mine, I said. The sentence landed between us, quiet and heavy. My daughter-in-law shifted in her chair. My son blinked once, then nodded slowly. That's not exactly what I meant, he said. But it is what you said, I replied. No anger, no accusation. Just the words, returned intact. Silence stretched. I let it. Finally, my daughter-in-law spoke. We may have rushed some assumptions, she said. We're just trying to make sure everything is fair. I reached into my purse and took out the folded paper I'd been carrying for days. I placed it on the table between us. I am too, I said. They both looked at it, then at me. I've reviewed my records, I continued. Payments, statements, documents connected to my name. My son's jaw tightened. He didn't speak. I won't be signing anything tonight, I said, or any night until everything is properly reviewed. My daughter-in-law opened her mouth, then closed it. My son leaned back, exhaled slowly. That may complicate things, he said. I'm aware, I replied. For the first time, neither of them looked certain. The conversation ended shortly after. Not resolved, not escalated, suspended. Later that night, I heard them talking behind closed doors, voices low, urgent. I didn't try to make out the words. I didn't need to. In my room, I sat on the bed and looked at the walls. The same walls I'd painted years ago. The same room I'd retreated to without complaint when space was needed. This time, the retreat felt different. I wasn't shrinking back. I was stepping aside deliberately. The next morning, my son was unusually quiet. My daughter-in-law avoided my eyes. Coffee was made without asking me if I wanted any. I poured my own. As I sat at the table, I realized something important. They weren't angry. They were unsettled. The version of me they had planned around, the one who stayed silent, who trusted too easily, who smoothed over discomfort, was no longer cooperating with their expectations. That didn't make me difficult. It made me unpredictable. And unpredictability, I'd learned, was uncomfortable for people who believed they had control. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, and placed it in the rack. For the first time since all of this began, I didn't feel like I was reacting. I felt like I was setting the pace. Whatever happened next wouldn't be rushed, wouldn't be emotional, wouldn't be loud. It would be decided carefully. And it would be decided with me fully present at the table. The house was quiet the morning I made my decision. Not tense, not heavy, just quiet. I stood in the doorway of the living room and looked around one last time, not with sadness, but with accuracy. The couch where I'd rocked my grandchildren to sleep. The lamp my husband had fixed twice because he refused to throw anything away. The window where I used to wait for everyone to come home. Everything was still there. What had changed was my place in it. My son came into the kitchen while I was pouring coffee. He watched me for a moment before speaking, as if measuring his words. We need to figure out what happens next, he said. I nodded. We do. He hesitated. I don't want this to turn into something ugly. I met his eyes. Neither do I. And I meant it. That afternoon, I gathered my things slowly. Not everything, just what mattered. The metal box, the notebook, the envelope I'd carried for weeks. A few photographs I didn't trust anyone else to handle with care. My daughter-in-law stood in the hallway and watched. She didn't comment. She didn't offer help. Her silence felt different now, uncertain, cautious. When I was done, I sat at the dining table, the same table where I'd been told the house was never mine. I placed my keys beside my purse and waited. They joined me a few minutes later. I've decided how I want to move forward, I said. No one interrupted. I won't be leaving quietly, and I won't be staying under conditions that erase me, I continued. Everything will be reviewed properly, with professionals, transparently. My son nodded slowly. My daughter-in-law looked down. I'm not here to punish anyone, I said, but I won't protect anyone from the truth either. No one argued. That night, I slept better than I had in months. In the weeks that followed, things changed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily. Paperwork moved out of the house and into offices where emotions didn't rewrite facts. Conversations became shorter, careful. The house no longer felt like a stage where I was expected to play a role. It felt temporary. One morning, as I packed the last box, my son stood in the doorway. He looked older than I remembered. I didn't mean to hurt you, he said. I know, I replied, but intent doesn't undo impact. He nodded. When I left, I didn't slam the door. I didn't look back. I drove to a small apartment I'd chosen myself. Nothing fancy, quiet, clean, mine. That first night, I made dinner for one and sat at a table no one else had ever claimed. I ate slowly, peacefully. I thought about the woman I'd been when all of this began, the one who stayed silent out of habit, the one who believed love meant enduring discomfort. I wasn't angry with her. She did the best she could with what she knew. But I wasn't her anymore. I had learned something important, something I wish I'd understood earlier. Family isn't proven by proximity. Love isn't proven by sacrifice that goes unseen. And silence is only noble when it doesn't cost you your dignity. When my phone buzzed that night, I didn't rush to answer. I let it ring. Then I turned it face down and went to the window. Outside, the city lights glowed softly. Ordinary. Unremarkable. And for the first time in a long while, so was my heart. I hadn't lost my home. I had reclaimed myself. And that, I finally understood, was the one thing no one else ever had the right to take.